What's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you very much again for coming back week after week. Really appreciate it. We've got so much to talk about tonight. I hope you really enjoyed the race this weekend. I thought it was one of the best that I can remember, probably since that incredible wet race, bizarrely enough, in Hockenheim, if you remember, which is also fantastic. But there were so many things going on, so many variables. It kept the teams on their toes, it kept the drivers on their toes. And I guess for us watching from home, it kept us on the edge of our seats all the way through, which is basically all of the perfect ingredients to form a fantastic live sporting event, which is what it was. So amazing. I hope you all enjoyed it and loved it wherever you're watching. Thank you all for coming back again and joining this week. We've got another hour to talk about all of that stuff, along with some nonsense as well mixed in, as always. But look, I'm not going to go through everybody saying hello. Thank you. I really appreciate you all from all over the world coming back. Really, really do. I'm recognising lots of names from all over the place that are coming back every week. So thank you. I really appreciate you all. But let's get into it, because there's no other place to start this other than by talking about that incredible achievement that Lewis Hamilton has finally sealed this weekend in the 7 times World Driver Championship stat that he's now accumulated. It's incredible. You know, you guys know that I was there for his first one, and whilst that was an amazing moment for me, it was an amazing moment for him back then. It was an incredible achievement that was all of his dreams coming true in that moment, becoming Formula One world champion. And just now, look, he's gone on to do, well, so many more, and I really don't think he's finished yet. Everything points to him and his team being dominant again, at least next year. We don't know what happens in 22 and beyond, but next year it's there for the taking. There's only really one man that could stand in his way, and unfortunately, Valtteri Bottas, unfortunately for Valtteri, he just does not seem to have anything to match up to Lewis. Certainly not over the course of a season. Yesterday was a really poor day from Valtteri's perspective. But let's talk about Lewis, because it was an incredible day from his perspective. Lapping his teammate is certainly not something he would have desperately wanted to try and achieve, but it was just kind of summing up of, look who's dominant here. Look who is the man. Look who's dominating this relationship in this team. Look who's getting the best out of this car. 7 world championships one world championship is an indescribably difficult thing to achieve. And I can tell you that with the benefit of some experience, of course. It's unbelievable. It takes the efforts of not just the driver, of course, but a huge number of people working way behind the scenes to get everything right. You know, you can't afford to have very many mistakes. You can't get away with very many mistakes over the course of a season. And Mercedes and Lewis are just not making any. I asked the chat earlier on, when was the last time you saw Lewis make a mistake on track when it mattered? And I genuinely can't think of an answer. Nobody could, as we discussed it earlier on today. I'm not sure when it was. I'm sure somebody will tell me. But when it mattered, Lewis steps up and he doesn't make the mistakes. And yesterday was a kind of summed all of that up, didn't it? Because it was the most treacherous conditions. Some of the best drivers on the grid all made mistakes. But the one guy who didn't make a single mistake, really, when it mattered, was Lewis Hamilton. Sergio Perez did an incredible job too. He did an excellent job. But look, Lewis stepped up from a position further back on the grid than he's used to, coming through incredibly difficult times, learning about how to make his car work in those conditions during the Grand Prix. So not having the answers right from the start, but figuring it out as he went along. And it resulted in what ended up being a fairly dominant win on the timesheets, and an incredible achievement to take those championships. So massive respect to him, massive respect to his team. I take my hats off to them all. I think they're doing something wonderful, and I honestly feel like we are lucky to be fans of this sport. I feel incredibly lucky because I've worked with the guy. You know, that's an amazing thing for me to have witnessed. But for us all to witness what he's doing right now, well, I think it's a privilege that we will probably not really appreciate fully until we look back on it later. So there we go. That's me talking about Lewis. You're all trying to figure out when Lewis last made his mistake. Tony Mears said Lewis hit Albon in Brazil. Yeah, I mean maybe that was it. Canada 2011 when he hit Jensen, says Dario108. There obviously are mistakes, but my point is obviously that they are very few and far between, and that's the thing that makes him a great. And it also is the thing that means that his team, just in both directions, his team can rely on Lewis 100%. And Lewis can also rely on his team. And it's exactly why at the end of yesterday's Grand Prix, when there was that really fine balance of a call to say, do we switch on to another set of intermediate tyres? Of course, Lewis had the luxury of a pit stop gap behind him. And the team were trying to err on the side of caution just in case the rain came or just in case his tyre had a failure. You know, Lewis asked the right questions on the radio. Is there any sign that this tyre is going to fail? Are we going to run out of tread? The answer came back, no, we're fine on that front, but there is rain coming. And then they relied on Lewis's experience to make the decision. He said, no, let's stay out. I want to deal with it. I'm in good form. The lap times are good. I don't want to have to go through a period of re-energising a brand new set of inters that could take laps. And I certainly don't want to come into a very wet pit lane and exit that pit lane on a new set of tyres that have got zero grip at that point. So he made the right call, and because he doesn't make mistakes, his team were able to 100% rely on him making that right call, and that's where they got that result from. So there we go. I thought it was an amazing day, an amazing way to win the championship, and on top of that, it was just an incredible race. So that's me going on about Lewis. I'm not going to spend the whole hour talking about it, although I feel like we could. An incredible guy, an incredible achievement, but there was a lot of other stuff that happened during that Grand Prix as well. So let's talk about some of that, because there was so much. I'm not even sure where to start. I've selected a couple of questions tonight, but mainly as kind of backup, because I'd love to leave this open to you guys to talk about where we go with this. There's just so many. So let's pick something out of the chat here, and we'll start us off with that. Let me see. Okay, so let's say why? Well, SJ says, why were the tyres so bad? I mean, let's rephrase that question into why was there no grip on the circuit? First of all, let's quickly cover off that. I'm sure many of you know the answer to that. The circuit was relaid only, less than 2 weeks ago. And what happened was, whenever you lay a new tarmac, it tends to be very smooth, because what they do is they mix in the aggregate with a mixture of the bitumen that binds it all together. They lay it out on the surface. They then roll it out to be flat, to be smooth. And when you lay a new bitumen, the stones, the pieces of aggregate, are all basically, most of them are covered up by the layer of bitumen. So the actual macro level at the surface is very smooth, because all the gaps in between the stones, the aggregate, are generally filled in with the bitumen. So over time, the bitumen, which is the really soft part, gets worn away, it gets flicked up with pieces coming off tyres, and you start to expose some of the bigger chunks of aggregate. And it's those bigger chunks that, if you really zoomed in on it, would look like a mini mountain range across the surface on a tiny macro level. It's that roughness that gives you the grip that starts to generate tyre temperature and therefore grip. We didn't have any of that because it was so brand new, and some of the oils that were in that mix, that aggregate, start to rise up to the top over time, over the first few weeks and months. That was all there as well. You add in a bit of rain mixed with the oils coming out of that mixture, and of course you have zero track grip compared to what Formula One is used to. So it wasn't really an effect of the tyres. Having said that, when we were in the dry, Pirelli had brought the hardest range of tyres in their range, because they weren't sure what the tarmac was going to be like. So they erred on the side of caution too. And all of those things combined together with low temperatures meant there was still no grip. And then when we got rain, of course, it got worse and worse and worse. So that's why we had a very weird set of circumstances where we saw cars almost like driving on ice. And that really set the tone for the weekend. I'll come on to some more about that in a moment. But I want to take some of your comments, because I really want this to be led by you lot tonight, because there's so much to talk about. Why wasn't Lewis sliding off the track on those worn tyres, says Fire Up. Right, so this can start us off into the conversation about, how did Lewis manage to do such a great job? And by the way, Lewis did slide off the track, if you remember, earlier on in the Grand Prix. The point about tyres, Formula One's modern tyres, is they work as we know, in a pretty limited temperature window. So if you think of a temperature spectrum of that tyre, there's a very fine band somewhere in the middle where they work. And what I mean by where they work is where the chemical compound of the tyre softens up, grips and binds in with the tarmac, and therefore you get grip, stops the car from sliding. Either side of that little tiny strip of temperature window in that range, even just by a few degrees either side of that, and they don't soften up, they don't interact and bind into those little grooves, those little the macro surface of the tarmac, and you don't generate grip. And it can be, particularly this weekend, because the surface was so slippery, that could be a difference of 5 seconds a lap or even more if you're not in the right temperature window. So the reason that this race, or one of the reasons this race was so spectacular, was because there wasn't one car that was better than any other for the entire weekend or for the entire Grand Prix. There were some cars and drivers in those cars that were better than others at different stages of the Grand Prix. So, for example, in the early part of the race, Lewis, like many drivers, were really struggling. He could not get his tyres into that temperature window, and therefore he was massively off the pace. Not just a few tenths off the pace, but seconds off the pace. The two Racing Point cars did manage to get the tyres into the right window, and therefore they did generate grip, and that's why they were able to pull away in the early phase of the race. So the characteristics of that Mercedes car, for example, let's use that as an example, meant that their car is much kinder on its tyres than perhaps some of the others, and therefore they were struggling to generate heat for that very same reason. It took them a long time to generate the heat. When they did build the heat up over lap after lap after lap, heat emanating from the brakes, using the tyres, generating temperature, then they start to come into their own. And that's one of the reasons why Lewis was able to stay on that tyre for so long, because he built the temperature up into the right window, and therefore he had the grip. As soon as you've got the grip on a weekend like this, you're catapulted in terms of lap time way, way out ahead of the guys that aren't. And there was no clearer example of that than Valtteri Bottas in the same car as Lewis. Yes, he had some damage to a front wing, which definitely wouldn't have helped, but he also kept having spins, and that, as soon as you spin, your tyre temperature drops, and then you've got to spend lap after lap after lap trying to build it back up into the right temperature band again. And then he had another spin, and he had some contact with somebody. Every time you do that, you may have to spend somewhere like 5 or even 10 laps working away to try and build the temperature back up. And then one more spin, you drop down, your temperature drops away, you lose another 10 laps trying to build that up. Well, Valtteri had, I don't know, I lost count of how many spins Valtteri had, but if you say he had 3 or 4 spins, and let's say it maybe took up to 10 laps to build that temperature up, that could be 40 laps where he's working to try and get the temperature in the right window. Lewis Hamilton didn't have any of that, and therefore he maybe spent 10 laps at the beginning trying to find the right temperature band and then stayed in it, crucially, and that was the biggest difference. So sorry, I went off on a proper rant there, but that, I hope, gives some idea as to why there was such disparity between drivers in the same car, and certainly the order, the pecking order of where we would normally expect performance to be could be so far off. 6 spins, you're all telling me, for Valtteri Bottas. Thanks very much. 6 spins, that was pretty bad, wasn't it? It was pretty embarrassing. But that's not just a simple feature of Valtteri being a terrible driver all of a sudden. That's a feature of his car had probably lost some performance because he'd lost a piece of the end plate on his front wing right from the very lap 1, I think. That definitely would make a difference. And then secondly, you get into this rut where you're further down the field, you're stuck in a train of cars, you can't get clear air to really push the car and generate tyre temperature, and you end up in this, really difficult cycle that it's very hard to get out of. So your position on the racetrack and in the race can definitely also have a huge impact into how you're able to manage that tyre temperature as the race goes on too. Bottas did a Massa in Silverstone 08. He did, yeah, I remember that. Josh Smith, yeah, that was another one, wasn't it? Felipe Massa had something similar, like 6 spins during the Grand Prix. It was every time you saw a camera pointing at him, he was pirouetting. Do you think Lewis should get an OBE, Dylan Wheater? Look, I'm not going to get into that because I really don't know the criteria about knighting somebody or giving them some kind of honour from the Queen. I don't know what more Lewis would need to do without knowing that criteria, because there are others that have definitely had honours from the Queen for less. But it's not up to me, it's up to those that make that decision. So I think Lewis can't do any more. I don't think it'll be a big thing for him. You know, he's trying to tick the records off in Formula One. And those other honours, I'm sure, will come, whether now or at some point in the future. But that's not anything that any of us in Formula One really can have much of an impact on. Right, let's see. 2 of those spins were on the same puddle, says Derry. Yeah, I mean... I mean, there is an argument to say if you spin in the same place, you know, a couple of laps apart from each other, perhaps you should have learnt from the first time. But I don't want to go too hard on Valtteri. He had a very tough weekend, and it's not just reflective of his pace or his talent, as we all know. Right, let's see what else we're going to go into. So Andrew P says, being good at building up tyre temperature is not what I would pay for to watch F1, or not what I'd pay to watch F1 for. So Andrew, decent point, okay, maybe a decent point, but I would argue, I would counter that by saying, what are you looking for from Formula One? Because you're looking for drivers doing the very best job. You know, they're being given a set of tools, whether that's a car, a set of tyres, an aero package, a circuit, a set of conditions, and then you want the best drivers in the world to figure out all of that and get the best from it. And of course, part of that is looking after your tyres. It always has been. There's never not been a situation in Formula One where you've had to look after your car, whether it's tyres or look after the engine or something else, manage fuel levels. That's a part of being a Formula One driver and a skill that these drivers have to master. We don't want them to not have any challenges, surely, do we? We want them. I'd love Andrew. I'd love you to come back on that and just clear it up with me, because I do understand what you're saying. Tyre chat can be really boring, and we certainly don't want tyre chat to always be dominant to the level it has been at times. So I definitely am with you on that. But I thought what we saw yesterday when it came to tyres was a really brilliant challenge that was something the drivers are not necessarily used to. And the fact that Lewis was patient and figured it out. You listen to his post-race interview. He said that he had no answers early on. He saw the cars in front of him disappearing because he didn't have tyre temperature. So he had to then dig into his own experience. He had to use the tools available on his own steering wheel and his own driving style, find different lines around the racetrack to be able to generate that temperature. That's the measure of a great driver, isn't it? Someone who can figure out the answers to a problem during a Grand Prix. So I thought that was great, but I'd love to know a bit more on what you think on that, mate. So do come back and I'll look out for it. Josh Smith says, I enjoy tyre chat. Well, I love tyre chat as well, but I'm a proper tyre geek. There we go. Do you think F1's become a lot about managing tyres rather than just driving talent? Well, isn't driving talent about managing tyres? There's got to be a balance, hasn't there? We've got to find a balance where we can't have it being solely about managing tyres. And I would argue that there is a case that perhaps it's become a bit too much like that. But because we've got such disparity in the cars themselves, so we've got so much variation in terms of the car performance, which if you go back many, many years to the glory days that we all look at being amazing and think, why can't it be like that again? There was never that disparity across the grid, or there wasn't always that disparity across the grid and the big gap between the guy who's out in front and the guy who's in fourth place, for example, a car that just simply can't compete. We didn't have that on such a regular basis. So now what we have to do is find ways to provide a challenge, like tyres that wear out or that go off or that have to be operating in a set temperature window, to be able to offer some varying strategy or some varying challenges to the drivers. So I do get what you're saying about tyre chat. Can be boring, can be dull. But on the flip side, until we get, maybe 2022 will be different. We'll have to wait and see. But in the current Formula One, tyres are our best way of providing some strategy, variation and a new challenge for the drivers. I thought yesterday actually was really interesting because of tyres, not despite them. Here we go. Rondell Furlong says, what do you think about Checo's drive versus Albon's? Now this is a really interesting point. We might as well get onto this, hadn't we? Checo versus Albon, and it looks like it could well be Checo versus Albon for the Red Bull seat. Hulkenberg, of course, still definitely in the frame, still available. But of course, he doesn't have the opportunity like Checo does to keep impressing week in, week out. To keep impressing in front of the Formula One fraternity. So Checo has the upper hand here because, like yesterday, he put in a blistering performance, a really strong performance where his experience really showed through. And like Lewis, he was patient. He did the right things on those tyres, making them last. I know he had a little mistake towards the end, but it was a small mistake. Could have been costly, but it was at least he didn't spin off. He didn't bin the car, which many others did. And those are all the things that Red Bull need right now, aren't they? They need somebody who's dependable, who's got experience. Maybe he's not going to be able to challenge a Max Verstappen on pure pace, but that's fine for Red Bull, isn't it? Because what they want is Max Verstappen to be doing his thing, to be the lead driver, to be challenging for race wins and championships. And then they want the second driver to be right there behind him in the fight so they can use that second car as part of their strategic tools against the likes of Mercedes, which they haven't had. And, Albon, unfortunately, who had a great weekend, let's be fair, this weekend, up until when he made that mistake. I mean, don't want to be too critical on him because his teammate Max Verstappen equally made some mistakes in the race as well. And that's perhaps the difference between those guys, the Verstappens, the Charles Leclerc, the Albon, who really, really fast drivers, really promising drivers for the future, the stars of the future of Formula One, surely, but they just haven't got the experience that Lewis has got to mix in with that incredible talent. And that was really what set the guys on the podium, and let's face it, they're all over 30, they're all very experienced guys, aside from the guys that didn't make the podium that you might rate as quicker drivers or more talented drivers and perhaps the stars of the future. It was experience that paid off this weekend. So in answer to your question, I would say I'd love to see Checo in that car. I don't want to see Alex Albon out on his ear, but I think unfortunately for him, it's a brutal sport, it's a business, it's a cutthroat, results-driven business, and he's not getting results. So you've got to say at some point he's had his chance, he's had a decent chance, and for whatever reason, and it may not just be down to him, but for whatever reason, he hasn't managed to get the results out of that car. SJ, we will discuss Michael Massey. I promise you, lots of you asking about Massey. I'm going to come on to that in a moment because I have got a question on that one, so I promise you we'll do that. But let's finish up on Albon. It sounds like they're going to let him run to the end of the season as expected and then make a decision. But all the impressions that I got over the weekend from everything Checo was saying, obviously he was very buoyed by that result, which is a great result for him. It feels to me like he would be the right choice. It brings a bit of cash as well, but I think that's just a bonus. Really, on his driving talents and his experience and his dependability, I would have Checo in that car in a shot. But there we go. That's just what I think. I'd love to know what you think, so do fire in your suggestions. Would it be Checo, would it be Hulk, or would it be Alex Albon or somebody else? Let me know. Is it the Red Bull jinx for Alex? I mean, Red Bull have not been kind to their young drivers, fairly or unfairly, but over time, even over many years, they've been pretty brutal with some of that driver program. Some of that has been justified. Some of it, I think they've gone too early. I think Martin Brundle mentioned it over the weekend. I think people like Jean-Eric Verne and who else got let go early? Who's their current simulator driver? Sebastian Buemi, I think got let go too early. Another amazing talent. I think there's a few of them actually that could have gone on to do greater things if they'd been given more time. You can't really say Alex Albon's not been given enough time, because how much further do you let this go? So I think they've been very fair to Alex, and it hasn't worked. It doesn't have to be the end of Alex's career by any means, but I think he's had his time at Red Bull, and perhaps it is time to move on. Scott Speed, another one that perhaps could have gone further. Buemi, thank you. Yes, it was Buemi. Carlos Sainz, yeah, you're right. Carlos Sainz too, George Alaimo says. It was another one, but look, at least, and that's perhaps a positive for Alex Albon. There's life after Red Bull, and Carlos Sainz is doing very well and is now about to go and sign and drive for Ferrari. So it's not a bad point. Right, shall we talk about Michael Massey then? Because everybody wants to. We'll tee it up with this question. Who was it from? Cloud64. Cloud64 says this. He says, is Michael Massey up to the job? A dangerous clanger this weekend. Hollywood safety cars, the mysterious black and white flag, variable track limits, leaving penalties till too late, etc. With K-Mag's complaint. So, good point, Cloud64. Lots of good points, in fact. Let's discuss that. I can see chat is going mad already. Michael Massey, let's first of all, before we go into these specific incidents, I want to give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt in that, imagine how hard it is to come in and fill the shoes as he did at relatively short notice of Charlie Whiting. I mean, that's a huge job. The other thing about that is that Charlie Whiting finished his role as race director incredibly experienced, having done it for years and years and years. Michael Massey has been race director in other series for a long time before building up to Formula One, and when he got the job, if you look back at his career prior to Formula One, if you look at the reasons he got the job, perfect choice for me. I couldn't think of anybody better. I have met him a few times in the past before he got to Formula One. He's a very sensible, methodical guy. When he got the job, for me, I thought, yeah, that's a no-brainer. He's perfect for this role. He'd been at the FIA previously as well, so he knew everybody, he knew the system, he'd worked under Charlie. He'd had the perfect teeing up, if you like, mentorship for that job. So that's the first thing. So it's a difficult job to step into. What I would say is over the course of last season, I thought he did a really decent job. Yeah, of course, there are some mistakes, but if you look back over Charlie's career, I'm sure you could pick out a number of things that we all would disagree with as well on that one. What I would say, particularly at the incidents that Cloud64 just mentioned over the last few months, I guess, particularly around this season that have happened, there are some that are explainable, and we've got to be careful not to jump on every single thing and take it as face value, because what we get on sitting on this side of the television is only a small percentage of the information that they have when making a decision. And an example of that, for example, is the decision to delay that call on Max Verstappen on yesterday's race of coming out over the pit exit line. On face value, during the race, you'd think, and I got so many messages on Instagram and Twitter from people going, what on earth is he doing? Why on earth are they delaying the decision on Max exiting the pit lane white line until after the race? And I must admit, I thought, that's weird, surely you just got to look at some cameras. The truth with that particular decision, and I think this has been explained since, but when you look at it, the onboard cameras are definitely inconclusive. And you've got to be conclusive if you're making a decision like this. It's like, VAR in a football match, or the tennis, the technology in tennis. You've got to be absolutely conclusive to the millimetre, haven't you, if you're going to penalise somebody or not. They couldn't work it out from the onboard camera. The offboard, the trackside camera, certainly wasn't clear enough. And so what they had to do was then go in after the race when they had access to different set of cameras, because they don't have a live feed from every single camera on the car. There are some cameras, for example, and this probably wasn't the one they used, but the 360 camera is not a live feed on every car. They can't take in that many live feeds from every car. So some cars, for example, will have their rear view camera as a live feed into FOM on the course of a race, but others can't, others won't. They just simply haven't got the bandwidth to take them all. So I have to assume, and I think this is true, that Max Verstappen's car wasn't one of those that had all of the onboard cameras as a live feed back to form. So the right thing to do, in my opinion, there was to wait until they had all of that information, access to more camera views, more camera angles, where they could generally get it right. And the result of all of that was that it was inconclusive. Yes, his tyre was on the line, but was it over the line? If you're going to make that call, you've got to be 100%, and they couldn't be 100%, which is why it ended up in no further action on that one. So I think in that decision, for example, I can't really argue with their decision to delay that until after the race, because if you want to make a decision with only half the information, you've got a chance of getting it wrong. And if you do that and then the information comes to light, they will look stupid and we'll all be shouting at them after the race. So on that sense, I would say some incidents you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt on. The one that there is simply no benefit of the doubt to give over the course of this weekend was the qualifying incident where cars were released on track in those horrific conditions with a safety truck still on the outside of the circuit, not through and safely out of the gravel trap and behind the barriers. That was unacceptable. It's unforgivable in many ways. We know what's happened in the past, and safety now should be the absolute priority when it comes to marshals and vehicles and equipment on the racetrack. The safety of the drivers themselves, but also those marshals that are helping to get that vehicle off. Now you could say, yes, it was an outlap. Yes, they were under yellow flags, but just look at the conditions they were going in, where tyre temperature on your outlap was everything. So you have to, as a driver, be pushing as hard as you can, as hard as you dare, to get tyre temperature into your tyres. You do that on a circuit like that, a slippery circuit like that, there is every chance you could come off. And there's every chance you could spin through that gravel trap and make a collision with that vehicle. So I don't think there's any way that anybody can defend Michael Massey and his team. And I'm sure you've all seen the explanation by now. He said that the clerk of the course had told him that by the time the cars had reached that part of the circuit, that recovery vehicle would have gone, and therefore they sent the cars out. Well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. If it's that close to being clear of the circuit, just hold the cars for another 30 seconds or a minute until it is simply behind the barriers, and then release the cars. I'm amazed that happened. I think it's inexcusable, and I mean, we can only hope that it will never happen again. I'm sure it won't, but it was just disastrous, potentially disastrous. So I do agree with you. I think that was a big mistake, and it was a big, this is, all right, nothing happened, but it was a serious mistake. You don't have to get serious consequences for it to be a serious mistake, and I think that's exactly what it was. Should he be sacked for it? No, I don't buy that either. I think it's a big mistake. I think that it was such a big mistake it won't happen again, and that's that. I think all you can do is learn from these mistakes. As I said before, Charlie Whiting and his team made a lot of mistakes over their time. As long as they learn from those mistakes, that's all we can ask for them. The problem with this one was that mistake had already happened a few years ago, and we thought we had learnt from it. So that was the big disappointment there. There we go. So yeah, lots of you kind of agreeing. Why would he even make an excuse? He is responsible. He is responsible. There is no excuse for it. That's exactly what I'm saying. Rob Graham, what lap was that? That was in qualifying. I think it was the start of Q2, if I remember rightly, wasn't it? After the red flag for, I don't know, Latifi, was it? I can't remember. It was in Q2. Let's see. What do you think of the AlphaTauri engine change? Have you ever been in the middle of changing engine and abandoned? Oh, that's a good one. Varun Sambi, yeah. So you may, I don't know if you may not have heard the full story of this, because I only, on Saturday night, on one of the AlphaTauri cars, they decided, it was Gasly's car I think, they decided to change the power unit because they had a few issues, and given that they'd qualified badly, they decided to change the power unit, take the penalty, because they didn't think it would be too much of an issue given where they'd qualified anyway. And then as they'd started that process of stripping the car apart, there were a whole raft of penalties began to come in. So the McLarens got thrown back, for example, didn't they? There were a couple of other penalties as well. And then they started to think, oh, hang on a minute, we're actually not as far back now as we thought we were going to be. So maybe it's not worth us taking the penalty for changing the engine. So having got permission to change the engine and having stripped half of it apart, they then went back to the FIA and said, actually, we've changed our mind. We want to leave the engine in. And the FIA then said, well, you've taken so much of this car apart, there's no way that any of us can determine whether you're putting it back together in the same state, which of course is what Parc Fermé requires you to do. So they said, I'm sorry guys, but you've stripped too much off it now. You're going to have to start from the back of the grid or from the pit lane anyway. So it was a total disaster. Varun, has that ever happened to me? I don't think in our day, we never had strategic engine changes because there was no penalty in that sense. We have been halfway through an engine change because somebody had thought that there was a fundamental problem with the engine, only to then later find halfway through the engine change that it was actually a software glitch or a software problem, and they could fix it with some code. And well, you can imagine the you can imagine the swear words that came out of my and all of my colleagues' mouths when we'd spent like 2 hours getting most of the way through an engine change, only for some, you know, conehead to come along and go, "Oh, sorry guys, yeah, it was a couple of ones and zeros out." So yeah, the mechanical crew kicked off against the digital crew. Let's put it that way. But yeah, it's quite rare, and it was a bit of almost a comical act from the AlphaTauri bunch that didn't really end up, you know, benefiting them in any way in the end, as it turned out. It was the engine that caught fire the other week. It was the engine, yeah, of course. It was the engine that caught fire. So they had that's how they justified changing it, of course. But the timing of that changing was strategic based on where they qualified, and the other penalties and the situation around this race where, you know, perhaps starting at the back wouldn't have been too much of an issue. Right, let's see. So Time to Choose says, everyone makes mistakes, Mark, but Massey repeatedly refusing to own up to his mistakes is the problem. Look, I'm going to go back to there have been a couple of safety mistakes which he can't, there's no excuse for. I'm not saying that he should be making excuses. He can't make excuses for any of those. All I'm saying is there are lots of other incidents that, you know, his explanations actually on to some of them have been entirely justified. So whilst we should be, we can and we should be hammering him for what happened this week and a couple of weeks ago in Imola, if you remember, or last week in Imola, there's no excuse for those. But let's not just jump on a bandwagon and hammer him for every decision we think has been wrong over the last 6 months or a year, because not all of them have when you've got all the information that he has. So let's hammer them for the ones he has got wrong recently, those safety issues, but not for just everything because it's Michael Massey. That's all I'm saying. Right, let's talk about Ferrari. Juicy Alanko says, Ferrari had a great weekend. They did have a great weekend, didn't they? And part of the reason for that was that this was a circuit and a set of conditions that meant power, you know, power deficit was not a big deal that it is on some other circuits. It was almost comical watching the start of the race, wasn't it? Where particularly Verstappen, I mean, these cars have got 1,000 horsepower, but if you can't put that 1,000 horsepower down through your tyres, you ain't going anywhere. And one thing I thought was interesting, that Max chose to start in first gear, which I was quite surprised at, because it's pretty common to start in second gear in a wet race anyway, or quite often in really bad conditions. On a race like that, on a race track like that, where we knew grip was going to be almost zero, I'd have thought it was almost a no-brainer to start in second. I don't know what other people did, but that was I don't know, there must be a reason for it, you know, and I'm sure Honda and the engineers have evaluated starting in second or starting in first and deemed first to be better. But it seemed like a strange one, and he just went nowhere, literally went nowhere. But let's talk about Ferrari, as you said. Ferrari, the power deficit didn't hamper them in the way that it has done at previous races. And therefore what we saw was a Ferrari that was, you know, able to use its tyres and get them switched on at various stages in the race. That was great. So that's a characteristic of the car and the way that they're being driven by both drivers this weekend. We also saw a Ferrari that, you know, I think was able to be less reliant on the aerodynamics as well. So this is a circuit, when you're going at very low speed, as they were comparatively, you're less reliant, if you like, or you get less peak influence from aerodynamics. Now that can manifest itself in obviously downforce, but it can also manifest itself in terms of following other cars. So the dirty air problem that we have at many circuits is minimised when you're going at slower speeds in those conditions. So when you're in the mid-pack, you're not as affected by the dirty air problem that you would be on another racetrack in dry conditions, for example, because everyone's going much slower and therefore the turbulent effect is less exaggerated. All of those factors came together to really give Ferrari, well, it levelled the playing field, and it gave Ferrari a much better opportunity. And what was great was they both took it. It was great to see Sebastian back up there fighting at the front. I thought that was really nice. Really nice that Seb was I think was the first to come over and congratulate Lewis. There's a huge amount of respect between those two. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was Charles Leclerc, having made that sort of rookie error, and it was a bit of a rookie error, wasn't it, on the last lap, costing himself second place down to fourth. What was interesting about that was his reaction for me. So Charles Leclerc, his first reaction was to scream into the radio, you may have heard this, shouting at himself, calling himself an idiot, absolutely berating himself. He was so angry with himself, understandably, because he's seeking perfection. You know, he wants the results. He wants to be the best, and he felt like he'd let himself down. Immediately after that raging reaction with his own underperformance, he very quickly, in the same moment, turned to congratulating Seb. And I thought that was really nice. He talked about, on the radio, on this cool down lap, how Seb's had a really tough year, and he was really pleased for him to see some success and be back on the podium. And I thought that was a real sign of the character of Charles Leclerc, both in terms of his determination to win, but also in his humility in defeat, and how he was very quickly switching his attention to congratulating the other side of his garage. There are not many drivers, I would say, that would have that train of thought in that moment. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, good weekend for Ferrari. It was nice to see them make the most of the opportunity, because I think that could be the last opportunity they have this year. The next 3 circuits we go to are surely not going to suit Ferrari. Most of them are power circuits, high-speed circuits. We're not likely to get wet conditions, but great to see them take advantage of that. Let's see. Charles is such a class act, says Rob Bonner. I honestly believe he is, and that's one of the reasons he will be successful. That determination. He's got to get on top of that anger, of course, but he beats himself up, which means that, you know, he probably won't make that mistake again, because it'll stamp such a mark in his memory of what happened that he'll learn from it, I'm sure. Yeah, everyone's saying that Charles is a real classy act, absolutely. Let's talk about Max. A lot of you there talking about the difference then between Charles and Max in terms of personality. I think what we saw with Max this weekend was, you know, because let's face it, there was a bit of an own goal from Red Bull, wasn't it? They had perhaps the best opportunity with, over the course of the race weekend, let's say, Mercedes to a large extent were out of the picture. So the guys who would normally almost guarantee the first 2 spots on the podium were gone. I know Lewis came back to win, but they didn't have a car that was anywhere near performing well over Friday or Saturday or the early part of Sunday. And yet Red Bull, relatively speaking at least, did. So what happened? Well, Max Verstappen showed his lack of experience. And I'm one of the biggest Max Verstappen fans out there, but he showed a lack of experience in that move on Perez, where he got tucked up underneath the rear wing in those conditions, so close through a right-hand kink with no grip. It's no surprise that he disappeared off the circuit. And in fact, he was quite lucky not to have a big one and end up in a wall somewhere. So that's the sort of thing that we don't see Lewis Hamilton doing. And that's the difference. Max has got unbelievable talent. And it does remind me a little bit of Lewis back in the early days, who was massively talented, but lacking in experience. Lewis has now got the whole lot. He's got the experience to match the talent. And Max will have that as well at some point, but he hasn't got it yet. And yesterday was a proper example of that, I would say. Max really screwed the pooch getting too close to Perez. He did. Okay, Daniel Delech says, lack of experience, it's his 6th season, mate. It is his 6th season, but he's still very young. And if you look at the comparison, as I was making there, between him and Lewis, I mean, there is no comparison in terms of the number of seasons they've done, but also in terms of how that experience is playing out in Lewis's career now and how Max is still learning. 6 years is not enough to learn everything you need to know about winning Formula One World Championships. Yeah, you might luck into a championship, you might have enough to get you a championship, but it's very unlikely you'll have enough to win 7 world championships on the trot or 7 world championships in a career with just a few seasons of experience behind you. You've got to build up that level of every, understanding every situation. I mean, those conditions we had yesterday, there was probably not one driver on the grid that had experienced anything quite to that level. But you can guarantee that Lewis can probably go back through his data banks and find something that will have given him a little bit of information where he can draw back on that experience of the past to know what to do and what not to do and where to do it and when to do it. Those are the things that come with experience. So, absolutely, Max is not a rookie. There's no question about that. But he definitely hasn't got the full set of experience that a Seb Vettel or a Lewis Hamilton has yet. Max will be champion in a Merc in 2023. Well, he could well be. Max is definitely world champion material. He's definitely quick enough. He's definitely good enough. He's a great talent. In fact, I would love to see him become world champion. It disappointed me yesterday that he threw it away because I want to see him winning races. I want to see him right at the front. I want to see him being the challenger for Lewis Hamilton, whenever that is able to happen, whether it's next year or beyond. Absolutely. But he's definitely world championship material. And will he be in a Merc? Not sure about that. We'll have to wait and see. ComCon says it would take me 6 seasons to find the drinks button. Richard Bennett says Max is impatient. Yesterday showed that. Well, I think at times Max is definitely impatient. That's also one of his strengths though, because if you compare him to Alex Albon, perhaps Alex is too patient. You want somebody who's willing to send it, who's willing to take a big lunge and go for an opportunity. That is exciting. That's an exciting driver. Max is an exciting driver. But you've got to temper that with the ability to get to the end of a Grand Prix. And, there have been a number of occasions when that hasn't worked out for Max. So impatience, yes. You don't want to temper that too. You don't want to hold that part of his personality back too much. But he's got to find the right balance, I would say. I don't think Max has the bottle to win a title. I hope he does though, says Andy Nixon. I disagree with that. I do think Max has got everything he needs to win a title. He just needs, first of all, he needs the right car, but also he needs to build on the experience or tap into the experience that he's building, I would say. Let's, hold on. Poll question, Sandy Barnes, poll question, beer o'clock in 15 minutes. Good point, Sandy. Well done. I forgot I'd done that. Right, 2 things I want to tap into here then. Let's just, before we get to the poll that I did earlier, I want to talk about tyres because somebody asked this question. Who was it? Here we go. It was Josh Smith. Good old Josh again. He says, I'm keen to understand more about how drivers made those inters work after being worn down to slicks on other circuits where the tyre worn down that much they would have fallen right off the cliff. And they absolutely did get worn down, didn't they? To an incredible level. In fact, I've got a picture here. Check that out. So that is Lewis's car at the end of the Grand Prix. And if you look closely at the tyres, obviously the nearest tyre to you, the left front, is perhaps the one in best condition. The right front tyre, you can see, is basically a slick. So that's first of all an indication, and you can actually learn a lot from these tyres at the end of a Grand Prix, and the teams definitely do. When a car like Lewis has left those tyres on for a really, really long stint, wear patterns on the tyres like this can give quite a lot of information away. So you can guarantee the other teams will have been taking photos of this. Somebody else said to me the other day, let's just come back to this, hold on. Somebody else said to me the other day, what happens? Could teams use the patterns left by the dirty water sprayed over a car during the race, like in Turkey, in a similar way to Flovi's paint? Absolutely, they do. If we go back to that picture, you can't quite see it in the picture, but at the end of a Grand Prix, you see the exact flow patterns on a dirty, wet race like that all over the car. And yes, what happens is Mercedes will probably take some pictures for their own aero department, absolutely. But also every other team in the pit lane is sending aero guys up with cameras to snap photos of all of these cars, not just the Mercedes, every car in Parc Fermé, because it's a rare opportunity to get a sort of freeze frame of where all the airflow is going around a car. So yes, they do that. And the reason I was brought onto that was we were talking about tyres, because it's the same. You can learn a lot from the wear patterns of tyres. So just looking at across the front tyres of Lewis's car there, you can see that the right front is obviously worn down as a slick in the centre part, the left front not so much. That's obviously because of the nature of this circuit being an anti-clockwise circuit. It's the right hand side of the car that's loaded up much more, particularly even more so in the dry, but around that long turn 8, the right front is the one that gets all the punishment. It's been lent on all the way around that long corner, and therefore that's the one that's worn most. What you can see is, of course, that it's worn right around the centre band of that tyre. So you can see that the whole tread pattern across the right across the surface is not being used. The tyres are running at pretty high pressures these days, which obviously, like you can imagine in any tyre, inflates them a bit like a balloon. The centre part is what makes most contact, and as the car rolls and moves around the circuit, it starts to even that wear pattern out, or spread that wear across the tyre. On the rear, you can see again on the rear left, same sort of thing. There's a very clear, so you've got this really wide tyre, but in the most part you're only using a relatively small percentage of that tyre because of the inflation, because of the temperature that's raising the inflation of that tyre, the pressure, blowing it up like a balloon. And those contact patches can tell quite a lot about how the car is handling, how they've got the car set up, what sort of camber angles are they operating in, you know, how much roll is in the car in terms of the tyre, how much weight transfer is moving around when on a circuit like this the car's leaning over to the right hand side, leaning all of its weight over to the right hand side. Comparing one car to another, you can actually see quite a lot about just how much of that load transfer is happening on this particular car. How is it spreading the load out? For example, if the left front tyre of Lewis's car there was, you know, nearly as worn as the right hand side, you'd say that there's perhaps a lot less roll in this Mercedes and it's got a much stiffer front end, but it doesn't. It's got obviously clearly got a little bit more of a softer front end, as you'd imagine in those particular conditions, and therefore the right hand side is worn an awful lot more. So some really interesting stuff you can pick up from all of that. But to answer Josh's question, the reason that Lewis's tyre there, as you can see, almost slick on the right front, or it is slick on the right front, how did they keep going? How do they not just wear out? And the answer to that is that on a normal slick tyre, of course, you've got the tread that's, I don't know, probably 10 millimeters, 12 millimeters thick, something like that. You wear that away, it doesn't look any different, but you wear that away and then eventually you go through it. In this situation where you've got a wet tyre, the treaded part, the chunks of that tyre are sat on top of a band of almost like slick tread. So you wear away the chunks of the grooved tyre, and then you've got some material of the slick part of a tyre, if you like. It's not quite like tread stuck onto a slick, but the treaded part obviously moves away. Those chunks of tyre, of rubber, move quite a lot. They wear away very easily and very quickly. So you have to have another layer of almost like a slick tyre rubber underneath. So that's why when you get rid of all the tread, you've still got quite a bit of life left in the tyre in terms of material. You've got no grip if it's wet, of course, but as it turned out, the conditions really favoured that slick tyre towards the end, as long as you're on the racing line. Step off it and you'll be in serious, serious trouble. But I hope, Josh, that answers your question. That's the answer to that one. Let me just see if there was something else. Oh yeah, that's right. Sandy just mentioned the poll. I asked the poll because Left One asked this question. He said, I think moving some races closer to wet weather conditions would spice up F1. The Turkish GP, I think, proves it. So could we benefit from shifting the calendar around and having more wet races? Because let's face it, if we look back at the most interesting races over recent times, they've all had an element of rain in them. I mean, there are some others that have been great without rain, but there have been a lot of incidents where rain has really brought the thing alive. So should we be trying to encourage more of that? Traditionally, the calendar follows the sunshine, and there are a number of reasons for that. if you're a promoter of a Formula One race, last thing you really want is to be trying to hold a massive outdoor event like that in the rain, because spectators don't want to come and sit in a grandstand in the rain or move around the circuit in the rain. So on a sunny day, you sell more tickets. So from that perspective, it makes sense. But should we be trying to encourage these varying conditions? And on that note, I asked a poll. This is very tongue-in-cheek, by the way. I asked a poll on the community tab earlier on, not because I think this is a good idea, but just to gauge some opinion on this. And I said, would you consider experimenting with trackside sprinkler systems, F1 races, to create variable conditions? Let's see what you said. Look at that. Pretty clear. 3/4 of you said, no way, it's not Mario Kart. But 1/4 of you, nearly 25%, said, why not? Give it a go if it's done in the right way. That's out of 1,500 votes. I thought probably what I expected, but still 1/4 of the people, and if you go down through the comments that everyone's left, a lot of people say absolutely. That race yesterday proved that the rain or the wet conditions make it exciting. So I'm not suggesting this is actually what we do. It's really just a kind of gauging of opinion, but the best races come from varying conditions. So how do we vary conditions? How do we make this kind of thing happen more frequently? You can rely on the weather, and that occasionally, maybe once a season, we'll throw up a race like this. Maybe that's enough. Maybe just throwing in a random wet race is enough. Or you can throw up a sprinkler system like they have at Paul Ricard, like Bernie used to suggest. You could turn it on at random times. You could have a random program that generates a random lap where the sprinklers come on. You could do it, but I get that it's totally gimmicky and a bit Mario Kart. Or you could do something else. You could do something with tyres, for example. You could make the tyres much more variable in terms of their performance. And also with the cars, we're trying to equalise the car performance. Is that going to have the effect we want in 2022? Well, only time will tell. But it was interesting to see what you thought. That it's an almost definitive no. Absolutely, we don't want to go down a gimmicky route. And I think that probably sums up the opinion of Formula One fans. But a little bit like qualifying races, I wonder if there might be an opportunity at somewhere like Paul Ricard, where it's typically a very dull race anyway. Should we not just give it a go on one particular weekend and see what happens? Just a thought. Anyway, it is almost beer o'clock. In fact, today it's not beer o'clock, it's whiskey o'clock. Yeah, that's about it, isn't it? Blimey, let's see what you're saying on this. Just take the front and rear wings off the cars and see what happens, says Terry Sabatine. Now, that is not such a stupid idea. And the reason I say that is the other, what happened this weekend with varying conditions is we had no grip. So there are other ways to generate no grip, aren't there? And taking off the downforce is one of those. So that's not as silly as it sounds. Make the cars have no downforce, relying on a bit more mechanical grip and driver skill, and therefore you get a different result. The problem with that is you start to figure it out, and the teams will figure it out, and you then keep it the same for everybody. What was great yesterday was that different cars were performing to different levels at different times in the race. So there wasn't one dominant car like we normally get with a Mercedes. The Mercedes was dominant towards the end in the hands of Lewis, but at other times it was the Racing Points. At other times the McLaren came good. That's what was great. Different car performance was shifting throughout the Grand Prix, and that's not such an easy thing to achieve in a natural way. Yes, Will White, make the cars shorter. I totally agree with that. Yes, cut the wings off, says Cosmos 2017. Sandy Barnes, you're like my agent telling me to plug Wheeler Dealers and Dream Car. Thanks, I appreciate it, because I could do with one, so thanks. Right, I tell you what, make them, here's a good one. Chris Green, make them use all 3 compounds in a race. I agree with you. I'd love to see that. Seems like a really easy thing to just try, even if we don't mandate it all the time. Why not try it? I'd love to see that. I don't think it's the answer for everything, but I do think it would be interesting, so I'd love to see that. Right, look, I'm going to have to stop there because it's 10 o'clock. A couple of things happening this week that I need to tell you about. First of all, please go and subscribe to the channel. I've got to say that. Somebody tells me off every week for not doing that. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, because I do a lot of videos. And if you don't want to miss any, you'll just get a little notification when I release one. So that's worth doing. Take you a second. Give the video a thumbs up from tonight. That'd be really great. Appreciate it. This week, I've got a couple of things. I've got a video coming up talking about that tyre grip and racetrack grip levels. I'm trying to work out how I do it, but I think I've got something interesting, a little experiment I can do for that. The new sim racing rig arrived today, so I'm going to start putting that together. I'm also putting together my Christmas F1 Christmas gift idea video. I do it every year, trying to bring in some new things this year. I've already got a whole bunch of stuff that people have sent me. Some of it's brilliant. If anyone sees something amazing or unusual, but F1 related, drop me a DM, let me know about it, and I might be able to feature it in the video. That will be coming up in the first week of December, I think, something like that. And what else? I don't know what else, but that's the beauty of it. It could be anything. Oh, I've got a really good video coming up, not yet, it'll be a few weeks yet, but about pit stop technology, pit stop guns. You're not going to want to miss that one. So go subscribe and then you won't miss it. Right, that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you for joining tonight. I really do. Generally, that was great. Really enjoyed it. We could have gone on for another hour, but I can't do that because I've got to go and drink this whiskey. Thanks very much. I'll see you soon. Have a good evening, folks. Ta-da.